I'm Jim Glassman, and I'm the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. I'd just like to acknowledge a few people here today. Mark Langdale, from whom you're going to hear a little bit later, who is the president of the George W. Bush Foundation, sitting in the front row. Margaret Spellings, from whom you're also going to hear, who is the chair of the Bush Institute's Education Advisory Board. And Margaret was, of course, the former Secretary of Education. And also Eddie Lazier, the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and a member of the George W. Bush Institute Advisory Board. Also like to thank our sponsors, the Illinois Policy Institute, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Highland Capital, and First Trust. And also special thanks to Byron Trott. The Bush Institute is the policy innovation arm of the George W. Bush Center, which also includes a library and museum. And the Bush Center has been under construction in Dallas for nearly 2 years now on 24 acres of the campus of Southern Methodist University. And it's almost done. It's a gorgeous building designed by Robert A.M. Stern, and we hope you'll all join us at the dedication in April of next year. Now, even though we don't have a building yet, the Bush Institute has been up and running now for the past 3 years. Here's some of the things that we've been doing. We lead a partnership that's saving women from dying of cervical cancer and breast cancer in Africa. We've launched an amazing online archive of video interviews with dissidents and freedom advocates, including the late Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia, the Dalai Lama, and many others. And what we're doing is sending their stories and providing moral support to dissidents working for freedom today in such places as Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba. We're also reforming education by building a network of thousands of schools that, with our help, are transforming leadership, specifically school principals. We're also working in middle schools, and in two separate programs, we're seeking to get more bang out of the taxpayers' bucks. That is, more productivity from teachers and administrators, and more accountability. And if that sounds familiar here in Chicago, it should, and it's not just happening in Chicago, it's happening around the world, and I'm sure Margaret will have a word or two to say about that. We've launched a Women's Institute that brings women of the Middle East to the United States, that trains them and mentors them and sends them back home to build networks and create a strong base for civil society. And with our military service initiative, we're helping veterans and their families. And along with that, just next week in Dallas, we'll be holding our second golf tournament for wounded warriors. And in everything we do, we're inspired and guided by the passion of President Bush and Mrs. Bush, and by the principles that they have lived. Principles like freedom is universal, and to whom much is given, much is required. One of those principles is free markets and free enterprise create prosperity and opportunity. And that's the basis of the 4% Growth Project, which was launched just last year. The idea is to find ways for America to grow at 4%, sustainable, real GDP, not 2%, which we've got now, even though we're supposed to be in a recovery, and not even 3%, which is our post-World War II average. We think America can grow at 4%. In July, Crown published the Institute's first book, The 4% Solution, with a foreword by President Bush and 21 chapters by academic and business experts, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, 2 of them, Robert Lucas and Gary Becker, from the University of Chicago. We suspect that tax policy offers the most leverage in boosting growth, and that's one of the reasons that we're here. Amity Shlaes will explain the rest. Amity Shlaes is a Chicago native. She's a senior fellow at the George W. Bush Institute and director of the 4% Growth Project. She joined the Bush Institute from the Council of Economic Advisors, from the Council on Foreign Relations. Someday she'll be at the Council of Economic Advisors. She's written 3 books, most recently The Forgotten Man, her revisionist history of the Great Depression, with tremendous resonance today. I just last week heard Rand Paul talking about the book on the ABC Sunday show. And her new biography of Calvin Coolidge will be out in a few months. Amity Shlaes.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning. We at the Bush Institute can't think of a place we'd rather come than here. Economic growth is the subject of our work, and there's no more appropriate place to talk about growth than Chicago, which is a city made from trade. It was long the avatar for American growth. Later today, we're going to move into the stock exchange room, which is a reproduction of the old real stock exchange, Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan's room. When that room was built in the 1890s, Illinois' population, Chicago's population, grew 54% just in those few years. And the growth of Chicago in that period was so fast they had trouble quantifying it. Mark Twain said about the growth of Chicago in that period, it is hopeless for the occasional visitor to try to keep up with Chicago. She outgrows prophecies faster than they can be made. Chicago was so dynamic in that period, the world admired it. So we're here to open an inquiry. What about growth now? This conference was planned well before the current teachers' strike, but the strike just reminds us why we need such a conference. Our own project is about faster growth. The reason the strike is so bitter, the reason we're in the second week of the strike is that we don't have fast growth. We have slow growth in Chicago, so people are fighting over a small pie. We're glad to have joining us in this inquiry the growth-oriented Illinois Policy Institute as our local partner, and to have our other partners who Jim mentioned, among them U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Secretary Spellings. First Trust Advisors, Brian Wesbury will be speaking. Byron Trott will be introducing at lunch, and so on. The nature of our inquiry couldn't be simpler, I want to say. It is to look at growth and tax policy. We had a first conference in New York earlier this year and set up our method. We ask, unlike other conferences, who's growing? Who's growing? And then we say, working backwards, what is their tax policy? So we're here now to look specifically at the Midwest. Fortunately, the United States is a lab with states and towns as test tubes. We see it, it's a natural experiment. In the spring, we looked nationally. Now we're getting granular. In our first session this morning, we're going to hear from policy experts across the Midwest. Then in the next session, we're going to get real from business leaders themselves. Next, we have a special breakout with David Booth, who gave so much to the University of Chicago. David will have a frank discussion with Jim Glassman about what a business life is like, why you move, where tax or other business factors fit into that, and that will be extraordinary. And I'm hoping Eddie Lazier will ask a question there too, because he's part of this story. Chicago's not just an economic city, it's a trade city, as I wrote in an op-ed in the Trib this morning. It's a transacting city, so we've dedicated a special session to just Chicago as trading place. And finally, over lunch, we're going to have a special treat here from Governor Mitch Daniels about the Hoosier learning curve, what Indiana has learned through its own experience of trying to chase growth. And introducing that governor will be both Mr. Trott and Ambassador Langdale, our leader at the Bush Center. Just a couple words more. What makes people come to a city? What makes people not come? That's what we'll be looking at. Is Chicago a city where a stranger can come? Is it transparent enough, or is it still the old daily city that I grew up in, a city of deals rather than prices? That's one of the things we'll be asking. A second focus, most people or many people assume that policy doesn't matter, that a federal or a state policy it is what it is, like weather, that you can raise or lower tax rates and nothing will happen. If there is one thing you take away from our work this morning, it is that policy matters. Businesses aren't just sensitive to policy, to tax rates, to regulation. They are exquisitely sensitive. So we're going to try to capture that sensitivity and demonstrate it. States and towns are in perpetual competition with one another, whether we acknowledge it or not. Those of us who are from Chicago would like to say we have no doubt Chicago can prevail in competition, especially if the city recalls and returns to its strength, which is as a trading place, a trading center, a place of transaction. I remember a quote from Carl Sandburg, who said, "The city is so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning, a ferocious competitor." And we have all hope for it. To launch the first discussion, the first round on Midwest competition is a man I view as a competitor himself, John Tillman, Chief Executive Officer of the Illinois Policy Institute. When those of us not from here look at Chicago, one of the figures who stands out is John and what he's done with the Institute now in its 10th year. You've seen John's name all over the teachers' strike, and with him will be his excellent colleagues, Ted Dabrowski, Christina Rasmussen, and Matt Denhart from our own Bush Center, as well as Mr. Hicks from Indiana. I'd just say one word about John's bio. He was an entrepreneur himself. He's had failure companies and somewhat successful companies and very successful companies. One was a public internet access kiosk company. Another had to do with sports and retail. John is the winner of the Thomas Rowe Award for his leadership in nonprofit work, which is very prestigious in our circles. That what he does means something to Chicago and to all of us who are working in policy. May I welcome John Tillman.